Alright guys, so we're on chapter 12 of Tortilla Flat, John Steinbeck. How Danny's friends assisted the pirate to keep a vow, and how as a reward for merit the pirate's dog saw a holy vision. Every afternoon the pirate pushed his empty wheelbarrow up the hill and into Danny's yard. He leaned it against the fence and covered it with a sack, then he buried his axe in the ground. For as everyone knows, it makes steel much harder to be buried. Last, he went into the house, reached into a Bull Durham bag, which hung around his neck on a string, took out the day's $quarter and gave it to Danny. Then Danny and the pirate and any other of the friends who happened to be in the house went solemnly into the bedroom, stepping over the bedding that littered the floor. While the paisanos looked on, Danny reached under his pillow, brought out the canvas bag, and deposited the new quarter. This practice had continued for a long time. The bag of money had become the symbolic center of the friendship, the point of trust about which the fraternity revolved. They were proud of the money, proud that they had never tampered with it. About the guardianship of the pirate's money there had grown a structure of self-respect, and not a little complacency. It is a fine thing for a man to be trusted. This money had long ceased in the minds of the friends to be currency. It is true that for a time they had dreamed of how much wine it would buy, but after a while they lost the conception of it as legal tender. The hoard was aimed at a gold candlestick, and this potential candlestick was the property of San Francisco de Assisi. It is far worse to defraud a saint than it is to take liberties with the law. One evening, by that quick and accurate telegraph no one understands, news came in that a Coast Guard cutter had gone on the rocks near Carmel. Big Joe Portuguese was away on his business of his own, but Danny and Pablo and Pelon and Jesus Maria and the pirate and his dogs joyfully started over the ridge. For if there was anything they loved, it was to pick up usable articles on the beach. This they thought the most exciting thing in the world, although they arrived a little late. They made up for lost time. All night the friends scurried about the beach, and they accumulated a good pile of flotsam, a 5-pound can of butter, several cases of canned goods, a water-soaked bow ditch, 2 pea jackets, a water barrel from a lifeboat, and a machine gun. When daylight came, they had a goodly pile under guard. They accepted a lump sum of $5 for the lot from one of the spectators, for it was out of the question to carry all those heavy things over 6 miles of steep hillside to Tortilla Flat. Because he had not cut his day's wood, the pirate received a quarter from Danny, and he put it in his Bull Durham bag. Then they started tiredly, but with a warm and expectant happiness, straight over the hills to Monterey. It was afternoon when they got back to Danny's house. The pirate ritualistically opened his bag and gave the quarter to Danny. The whole squad trooped into the other room. Danny reached under the pillow and his hand came out empty. He threw the pillow back, threw the mattress back, and then he turned slowly to his friends, and his eyes had become as fierce as a tiger's eyes. He looked from face to face, and on everyone saw horror and indignation that could not be simulated. "Well," he said, "well?" The pirate began to cry. Danny put his arm around his shoulder. "Do not cry, little friend," he said ominously. "Thou wilt have thy money again." The paisanos went silently out of the room. Danny walked out into the yard and found a heavy pine stick 3 feet long and swung it experimentally. Pablo went into the kitchen and returned bearing an ancient can opener with a vicious blade. Jesus Maria from under the house put out a broken pick handle. The pirate watched them bewilderedly. They all came back to the house and sat quietly down. The pirate aimed down the hill with his thumb. "Him?" he asked. Danny nodded slowly. His eyes were veiled and deadly. His chin stuck out, and as he sat in the chair, his whole body weaved a little like a rattlesnake aiming to strike. The pirate went into the yard and dug up his axe. For a long time they sat in the house. No words were spoken, but a wave of cold fury washed and crouched in the room. The feeling in the house was the feeling of a rock when the fuse is burning in toward the dynamite. The afternoon waned, the sun went behind the hill, the whole of Tortilla Flat seemed hushed and expectant. They heard his footsteps on the street and their hands tightened on their sticks. Joe Portuguese walked uncertainty up on the porch and in at the front door. He had a gallon of wine in his hand. His eyes went uneasily from face to face, but the friends sat still and did not look directly at him. "Hello," said Big Joe. "Hello," said Danny. He stood up and stretched lazily. He did not look at Big Joe. He did not walk directly toward him, but at an angle as though to pass him. When he was abreast, he struck with the speed of a striking snake fair on the back of Big Joe's head. The stick crashed, and Big Joe went down completely out. Danny thoughtfully took a string of rawhide from his pocket and tied the Portuguese's thumbs together. "Now water," he said. Pablo threw a bucket of water in Big Joe's face. He turned his head and stretched his neck like a chicken. Then he opened his eyes and looked dazedly at his friends. They did not speak to him at all. Danny measured his distance carefully like a golfer addressing the ball. His stick smashed on Big Joe's shoulder, then the friends went about the business in a cold and methodical manner. Jesus Maria took the legs, Danny the shoulders and chest. Big Joe howled and rolled on the floor. They covered his body from the neck down. Each blow found a new space and welted it. The shrieks were deafening. The pirate stood helplessly by, holding his axe. At last, when the whole front of the body was one bruise, they stopped. Pablo knelt at Big Joe's head with his can opener. Balone took off the Portuguese shoes and picked up his stick again. Excuse me. Then Big Joe squalled with fear. "It's buried out by the front gate," he cried. "For the love of Christ, don't kill me." Danny and Pilon went out the front door, and in a few minutes they came back carrying the canvas bag. "How much did you take out?" Danny asked. There was no inflection in his voice at all. "Only 4, honest to God, only took 4, and I'll work and put them back." Danny leaned down, took him by the shoulder, and rolled him over on his face. Then the friends went over his back with the same deadly precision. The cries grew weaker, but the work only stopped when Big Joe was beaten into unconsciousness. Then Balone tore off the blue shirt and exposed the pulpy raw back. With the can opener, he cross-hatched the skin so deftly that a little blood ran from each line. Pablo brought the salt to him and helped him to rub it in all over the torn back. At last, Danny threw a blanket over the unconscious man. "I think it will be honest now," said Danny. "We should count the money," Balone observed. "We have not counted it for a long time." They opened Big Joe's gallon of wine and poured the fruit jars full, for they were tired from their work and their emotions were exhausted. Then they counted the quarters out in piles of 10 and excitedly counted again. "Pirate," Danny cried, "there are 7 over 1,000. Thy time is done. The day is come for thee to buy thy candlestick for San Francisco." The day had been too full for the pirate. He went into the corner with his dogs, and he put his head down on Fluff and burst into hysterical sobs. The dogs moved uneasily about, and they licked his ears and pushed at his head with their noses. But Fluff, which is part of the dog's name, sensible of the honor of being chosen, lay quietly and nuzzled the thick hair on the pirate's neck. Danny put all the money back in the bag and the bag under his pillow again. Now Big Joe came to and groaned, for the salt was working into his back. The paisanos paid no attention to him until at last Jesus Maria, that prayed to the humanities, untied Big Joe's thumbs and gave him a jar of wine. Even the enemies of our Savior gave him a little comfort, he excused himself. That action broke up the punishment. The friends gathered tenderly about Big Joe. They laid him on Danny's bed and washed the salt out of his wounds. They put cold cloths on his head and kept his jar full of wine. Big Joe moaned whenever they touched him. His morals were probably untouched, but it would have been safe to prophesy that never again would he steal from the paisanos of Danny's house. The pirate's hysteria was over. He drank his wine and his face shone with pleasure while he listened to Danny make plans for him. "If we take all this money into town, to the bank, they will think we have stolen it from a slot machine. We must take this money to Father Ramon and tell him about it. Then he will buy the candlestick. He will buy the gold candlestick and he will bless it. And the pirate will go into the church. Maybe Father Ramon will say a word about him on Sunday. The pirate must be there to hear." Balone looked distastefully at the pirate's dirty, ragged clothes. "Tomorrow," he said sternly, "you must take the 7 extra 2 bitsies and buy some decent clothes. For ordinary times these may be all right, but on such an occasion as this, you cannot go into the church looking like such a gutter rat. It will not be a compliment to your friends." The pirate beamed at him. "Tomorrow I will do it," he promised. The next morning, true to his promise, he went down to Monterey. He shopped carefully and bargained with an astuteness that seemed to belie the fact that he had bought nothing in over 2 years. He came back to Danny's house in triumph, bearing a huge silk handkerchief in purple and green, and also a broad belt studded profusely with colored glass jewels. His friends admired his purchases. "But what are you going to wear?" Danny asked despairingly. 2 toes are out of your shoes where you cut holes to ease your bunions. You have only ragged overalls and no hat." "We will have to lend him clothes," said Jesus Maria. "I have a coat and vest. Balone has his father's good hat. You, Danny, have a shirt, and Big Joe has those fine blue pants." "But then we can't go," Balone protested. "It is not our candlestick," said Jesus Maria. "Father Ramon is not likely to say anything nice about us." That afternoon they convoyed the treasure to the priest's house. He listened to the story of the sick dog, and his eyes softened. And then, father, said the pirate, there was that good little dog, and his nose was dry, and his eyes were like the glass of bottles out of the sea, and he groaned because he hurt inside. And then, father, I promised a gold candlestick of 1,000 days to San Francisco. He is really my patron, father. And then there was a miracle, for that dog wagged his tail 3 times, and right away he started to get well. It was a miracle from San Francisco, father, wasn't it? The priest nodded his head gravely. Yes, he said, it was a miracle sent by our good Saint Francis. I will buy the candlestick for thee. The pirate was very glad, for it is no little thing to have one's prayer answered with a true miracle. If it were noised about, the pirate would have a higher station on Tortilla Flat. Already his friends looked at him with a new respect. They thought no more of his intelligence than they had before, but they knew now that his meager wits were supplemented with all the power of heaven and all the strength of the saints. They walked back up to Danny's house, and the dogs walked behind him. The pirate felt that he had been washed in a golden fluid of beatitude. Little chills and fevers of pleasure chased one another through his body. The paisanos were glad they had guarded his money, for even they took a little holiness from the act. Balone was relieved that he had not stolen the money in the first place. What terrible things might not have happened if he had taken the 2 bitsies belonging to a saint. All of the friends were as subdued as though they were in church. The $5 from the salvage had lain like fire in Danny's pocket, but now he knew what to do with it. He and Balone went to the market and bought 7 pounds of hamburger and a bag of onions and bread and a big paper of candy. Pablo and Jesus Maria went to Torralli's for 2 gallons of wine, and not a drop did they drink on the way home either. That night when the fire was lighted and 2 candles burned on the table, the friends feasted themselves to repletion. It was a party in the pirate's honor. He behaved himself with a great deal of dignity. He smiled and smiled when he should have been grave, though, but he couldn't help that. After they had eaten enormously, they sat back and sipped wine out of the fruit jars. Our little friend, they called the pirate. Jesus Maria asked, how did you feel when it happened, when you promised a candlestick and the dog began to get well? How did you feel? Did you see any holy vision? The pirate tried to remember. I don't think so. Maybe I saw a little vision. Maybe I saw San Francisco in the air, and he was shining like the sun. Wouldn't you remember that? Balone demanded. Yes, I think I remember. San Francisco looked on me, and he smiled like the good saint he is. Then I knew the miracle was done, he said. Be good to little doggies, you dirty man. He called you that? Well, I was, and he is not a saint to be telling lies. I don't think you remember that at all, said Pablo. Well, maybe not. I think I do, though. The pirate was drunk with happiness from the honor and the attention. My grandmother saw the Holy Virgin, said Jesus Maria. She was sick to death, and I myself heard her cry out, she said. Oe, I see the Mother of God. Oe, my dear Mary, full of grace. It is given to some to see these things, said Danny. My father was not a very good man, but he sometimes saw saints, and sometimes he saw bad things. It depended on whether he was good or bad when he saw them. Have you ever seen any other visions, pirate? No, said the pirate. I would be afraid to see any more. It was a decorous party for a long time. The friends knew that they were not alone this night. Through the walls and the windows and the roof, they could feel the eyes of the holy saints looking down upon them. On Sunday your candlestick will be there, said Balone. We cannot go, for you will be wearing our clothes. I do not say Father Ramon will mention you by name, but maybe he will say something about the candlestick. You must try to remember what he says, pirate, so you can tell us. The Balone grew stern. Today, my little friend, there were dogs all over Father Ramon's house. That was all right for today, but you must remember not to take them to the church on Sunday. It is not fitting that dogs should be in the church. Leave the dogs at home. The pirate looked disappointed. They want to go, he cried. How can I leave them? Where can I leave them? Pablo was shocked. In this affair so far thou hast conducted thyself with merit, little pirate. Right at the last, do you wish to commit sacrilege? No, said the pirate humbly. Then leave thy dogs here, and we will take care of them. It will be a sacrilege to take them into the church. It was curious how soberly they drank that night. It was 3 hours before they sang even an obscene song, and it was late before their thoughts strayed to light women. And by the time their minds turned to fighting, they were almost too sleepy to fight. This evening was a great good marker in their lives. On Sunday morning, the preparation was violent. They washed the pirate and inspected his ears and his nostrils. Big Joe, wrapped in a blanket, watched the pirate put on his blue serge trousers. Balone brought out his father's hat. They persuaded the pirate not to wear his jewels-studded belt outside his coat, and showed him how he could leave his coat open so that the jewels flashed now and then. The item of shoes gave the most trouble. Big Joe had the only shoes big enough for the pirate, and his were worse even than the pirate's. The difficulty lay in the holes cut for the comfort of bunions where the toes showed through. Balone solved it finally with a little soot from the inside of the stove. While rubbed into the skin, the soot made it quite difficult to see the bunion holes. At last he was ready, Balloon's father's hat rakishly on his head. Danny's shirt, Big Joe's pants, the huge handkerchief around his neck, and at intervals the flashing of the jeweled belt. He walked for the friends to inspect him, and they looked on critically. "Pick up your feet, pirate. Don't drag your heels. Stop picking at your handkerchief. Those people who see you will think you are not in the habit of good clothes." At last the pirate turned to his friends. "If those dogs could only come with me," he complained, "I would tell them they must not come in the church." But the paisanos were firm. "No," said Danny. "They might get in some way. We will keep them here in the house for you." "They won't like it," said the pirate helplessly. "They will be lonely, maybe." He turned to the dogs in the corner. "You must stay here," he said. "It will not be good for you to go to church. Stay with my friends until I come back again." And then he slipped out and closed the door behind him. Instantly a wild clamor of barking and howling broke out in the house. Only his faith in the judgment of his friends prevented the pirate's relenting. As he walked down the street, he felt naked and unprotected without his dogs. It was as though one of his senses were gone. He was frightened to be out alone. Anyone might attack him, but he walked bravely on, through the town and out to the church of San Carlos. Now before the service began, the swinging doors were open. The pirate dipped holy water out of the marble font, crossed himself, genuflected before the Virgin, went into the church, did his duty to the altar, and sat down. The long church was rather dark, but the high altar was on fire with candles, and in front of the images at the sides, the votive lights were burning. The old and sweet incense perfumed the church. For a time the pirate sat looking at the altar, but it was too remote, too holy to think about very much, too unapproachable by a poor man. His eyes sought something warmer, something that would not frighten him, and there, in front of the figure of St. Francis, was a beautiful golden candlestick, and in it a tall candle was burning. The pirate sighed with excitement, and although the people came in and the swinging doors were shut and the service began, and the pirate went through the form, he could not stop looking at his saint and at the candlestick. It was so beautiful he could not believe that he, the pirate, had given it. He searched the face of the saint to see whether St. Francis liked the candlestick. He was sure the image smiled a little now and then, the recurring smile of one who thinks of pleasant things. At last the sermon began. There was a new beauty in the church, Father Ramon said. One of the children of the church has given a golden candlestick to the glory of St. Francis. He told the story of the dog, then told it rather badly on purpose. His eyes searched the faces of the parishioners until we saw little smiles appear there. "It is not a thing to be considered funny," he said. "St. Francis loved the beasts so much that he preached to them." Then Father Ramon told the story of the bad wolf of Jubio, and he told of the wild turtle doves and of the sister larks. The pirate looked at him in wonder as the sermon went on. Suddenly a rushing sound came from the door. A furious barking and scratching broke out. The door swung wildly, and in rushed Fluff and Rudolph, Enrique, Pajarito, and Senor Alec Thompson. They raised their noses and then darted in a struggling squad to the pirate. They leaped upon him with little cries and whinings. They swarmed over him. The priest stopped talking and looked sternly down toward the commotion. The pirate looked back helplessly in agony. So it was in vain, and the sacrilege was committed. Then Father Ramon laughed, and the congregation laughed. "Take the dogs outside," he said. "Let them wait until we are through." The dogs love pirate. The pirate, with embarrassed, apologetic gestures, conducted his dogs outside. "It is wrong," he said to them. "I am angry with you. Oh, I am ashamed of you." The dogs cringed to the ground and whined piteously. "I know what you did," said the pirate. "You bit my friends, you broke a window, and you came. Now stay here and wait, oh wicked dogs, oh dogs of sacrilege." He left them stricken with grief and repentance and went back into the church. The people, still laughing, turned and looked at him until he sank into his seat and tried to efface himself. "Do not be ashamed," Father Ramon said. "It is no sin to be loved by your dogs, and no sin to love them. See how St. Francis loved the beasts." Then he told more stories of that good saint. The embarrassment left the pirate. His lips moved. "Oh," he thought, "if the dogs could only hear this, they would be glad if they could know all this. They could be glad if they could know all this." When the sermon was over, his ears still rang with the stories. Automatically he followed the ritual, but he did not hear the service, and when it was over he rushed for the door. He was first out of the church. The dogs, still sad and diffident, crowded about him. "Come," he cried, "I have some things to tell you." He started at a trot up the hill toward the pine forest, and the dogs galloped and bounced about him. He came at last to the shelter of the woods, and still he went on until he found a long aisle among the pines, where the branches met overhead, where the tree trunks were near together. For a moment he looked helplessly about. "I want it to be the way it was," he said. "If only you could have been there and heard the Father say it." He laid one big stone on top of another. Now here is the image, he told the dog. He stuck a little stick in the ground. Right here is the candlestick with the candle in it. It was dusky in the glade, and the air was sweet with pine resin. The trees whispered softly in the breeze. The pirate said with authority, "Now, Enrique, you sit here, and you, Rudolph, here. I want Fluff here because he is the littlest. Pajarita, thou great fool, sit here and make no trouble. Senor Alec Thompson, you may not lie down." Thus he arranged them in 2 rows, 2 in the front line and 3 in the back. "I want to tell you how it was," he said. "You are forgiven for breaking into the church. Father Ramon said it was no sacrilege this time. Now attention, I have things to tell." The dogs sat in their places and watched him earnestly. Senor Alec Thompson flapped his tail until the pirate turned to him. "Here is no place for that," he said. "St. Francis would not mind, but I do not like you to wag your tail while you listen. Now I am going to tell you about St. Francis." That day his memory was inspired. The sun found interstices in the foliage and threw brilliant patterns on the pine needle carpet. The dogs sat patiently, their eyes on the pirate's lips. He told everything the priest had told, all the stories, all the observations. Hardly a word was out of its place. When he was done, he regarded the dogs solemnly. "St. Francis did all that," he said. The trees hushed their whispering, the forest was silent and enchanted. Suddenly there was a tiny sound behind the pirate. All the dogs looked up. The pirate was afraid to turn his head. A long moment passed. And then the moment was over. The dogs lowered their eyes. The treetops stirred to life again, and the sunlight patterns moved bewilderingly. The pirate was so happy that his heart pained him. "Did you see him?" he cried. "Was it San Francisco? Oh, what good dogs you must be to see a vision." The dogs leaped up at his tone, their mouths open and their tails threshed joyfully. St. Francis even loved the beasts.